The book, The World is for Sale, Chapter 1, The Pioneers. As Theodor Weiser approached the Soviet border, he felt a shudder of fear. Traveling from Western Europe to Soviet Union in 1954 would have been a daunting journey for anyone, but for Weiser it required particular courage. As a soldier in the German army, he had been captured by Soviet forces in the Second World War and made a prisoner on the Eastern Front. Now in his 40s, but with the memories of his time in the Soviet prison camp still fresh, this trip would be his first to Russia as a free man. At the last minute, fearing that someone he'd encountered during the war might recognize him, he bought a red cap and pulled it down over his eyes. Weiser was in groundbreaking territory. He was traveling to the capital of communism at a time when the Cold War dominated public discourse in the West, since a Soviet-backed coup in the Czechoslovakia in 1948. Western Europe had become increasingly alarmed about the threat of an assertive Soviet Union on its doorstep. And America was gripped by the Red Scare ripped up by Senator Joseph McCarthy's public denunciations of suspected communists. But Weiser was not the kind of man to be easily deterred. He had set off from Hamburg, determined to buy some oil, and he wasn't going to leave without a deal. He made his way through Moscow's wide, empty highways to one of the few hotels where foreigners were permitted to stay, and waited for the Soviet bureaucracy to take notice of him. He didn't have to wait for long. Soon, he had succeeded in securing a dinner appointment with Evgeny Gurov, the head of Soyuz Export, the government agency that controlled the Soviet Union's oil trade. Gurov was an ideologue who recognized earlier than many others the potential for oil to be used as a strategic weapon. Weiser, on the other hand, was not motivated by ideology but by profit. His company, Mabanaft, was a distributor of fuel across West Germany, and it was losing money. Weiser needed to find new sources of oil to sell to his clients, and that meant going where few others would dare. No record remains of where the two men dined or what they ate, but it must have been a peculiar affair. One of the Soviet Union's top trade officials sitting at a table with a former prisoner of war, toasting their new acquaintance under the watchful eyes of KGB. There was a period of negotiation, but Weiser's perseverance would ultimately be rewarded. Soyuz Export sold him one cargo of diesel for resale in West Germany. The trader's pioneering spirit would prove costly, however, at least initially. On his return to Germany, his willingness to deal with the Cold War adversary meant he was shunned by much of the oil industry. The shipping companies he had been using to transport his fuel around the country refused to do business with him, on the grounds that their other customers didn't want to charter ships that had previously held oil from Soviet Union. But Weiser, a consummate networker with a broad, open face and winning smile, knew he had secured the only thing that mattered from his trip to Moscow, a contact behind the Iron Curtain. His first deal marked the beginning of a relationship that would continue for years, underpinning the profits of his trading business. In 1956, Gurov visited Weiser in return, and in Munich He signed a one-year contract to sell diesel to Mabanaft, his company. Soon, the German trader was also buying crude oil from the Soviets. The early deals with the Soviet Union were a personal triumph for Weisser, a testament of his courage, tenacity, and charm. But they were also a sign of how the world was changing and the increasingly critical role that commodity traders like Weisser would play in it. After decades of economic depression, stagnation, and war, the world was entering an era of stability and economic prosperity. The horrors of war had given way to a peace policed by the US's growing military might, the Pax America, where living conditions in the mid-40s had been marked by price control and rationing. By the 60s, a growing number of households in the US, Europe, and Japan could afford televisions, refrigerators, and cars. Between 1950 and 55, more than half of the households in America bought a television. Everywhere, new trade routes were opening as nationalism and protectionism gave way to free trade and global markets. The world economy was growing at the fastest rate on record, driving ever greater consumption of natural resources. The period became known as the Golden Age of capitalism. Weisser had understood that this new world held unprecedented opportunities for a company whose entire business was international trading. Never before had a commodity trader been able to paint on such a global canvas. He was not alone. Around the world, a new generation of commodity traders was exploiting the opportunities created by the booming global economy. In New York, Ludwig Jesselson, a brilliant and intense young metal trader who had fled to the US to escape the anti-Semitism of Nazi Germany, had a similar vision. He would lead his company, Philip Brothers, to become so dominant that it took on the biggest banks on Wall Street, giving birth to a family of trading companies that still dominates the global commodity markets nowadays. In Minnesota, John H. Macmillan, Jr., a grain trader who had taken over the running of his family company, was determined to turn its fortunes around. That family company, Cargill, would go to become America's largest private corporation, making Macmillan's descendants some of the richest people on the planet. These three men were the founding fathers of the modern commodity trading industry, where their predecessor had focused on local niches. They saw that the whole world was becoming one market. Everything was for sale. Potential buyers were everywhere. Decades before globalization became an economic buzzword, they created businesses that were based on it in all but name. And as international trade expanded and became a central part of modern economy, their companies would be its ushers, shaping it at the same time as profiting from it and forging a business model that would define the commodities trading industry for decades to come. Over the next 20 years, commodity trading would be transformed from a small-time business into one of the most important industries in the world economy. Traders such as Weisser, Jesselson, and Macmillan, the Cargill, would become paragons of the new economic order, amassing extraordinary wealth and being welcomed into presidential palaces around the world as masters of the Earth's natural resources. It was a revolution that largely went unnoticed by politicians and the wider public. Only after decades of quiet growth would the world understand how central the commodity traders had become to the global economy. When the retaliation came in the 70s, it would bring the richest nations on the planet to their knees. All of a sudden, policymakers would wake up to the fact that the commodity traders, a group they had barely realized existed, had accumulated unprecedented power over the world energy, metals, and food. The history of commodity trading goes back to the dawn of the mankind, when the first settled humans started to buy and sell stones and metals, perhaps in exchange for grains. Indeed, the tendency to truck and barter, to trade, in seen the anthropologists as one of the activities that marked the beginning of modern human behavior. But the first commodity trading companies that bear any resemblance to today's traders did not appear until the 19th century. For centuries, bands of merchants, adventurers, had been traveling around the world seeking valuable resources to sell back at home. The most successful of them, the East India Company, governed the Indian subcontinent for several decades. With the Industrial Revolution, however, the trading resources was transformed. The invention of the steamship meant that, for the first time, long-distance commodity trading wasn't at the mercy of the winds. The cost of transporting goods fell precipitously, and as a result, it became viable to ship not just tea, spices, and precious metals over long distances, but also lower valued goods like grains and ores. And the telegraph ushered in an era of near instant global communications. In August 1858, the first telegraph line across the Atlantic opened, immediately cutting the time it took to deliver a message from London to New York from nearly 2 weeks to just a few minutes. With these technological developments came the first dedicated commodity trading companies. Merchants sprang up to buy and sell the scrap metals and residues that were the waste products of their burgeoning industrial age, and grain traders delivered food to the growing metropolises full of hungry workers. The 19th century metals trade grew up in Europe's industrial heartland, dominated by three German companies. The 19th century Aaron Hirsch and Son, Metallgesellschaft and Beer, Saltheimer and Co., Philip Brothers, the company that Ludwig Jesselson would later lead, grew out of the German tradition. Its founders, Julius Philipp, had begun trading from his apartment in Hamburg in 1901, and in 1909 his brother Oscar moved to London to establish Philip Brothers. The first traders on agricultural commodities were more scattered, with different companies rising up to dominate particular regions or market niches. In the words breadbasket, grain trading companies were set up to transform wheat and corn from the farm to the cities. In the United States, their number included Cargill, founded when the son of the Scottish immigrant opened his first grain silo in 1865. The industry fell on hard times during the First and Second World Wars. Entire trading dynasties in Europe were lost, and the families behind some of them, many of which were Jewish, had to flee the advancing Nazi army. Not all of them got out in time. Julius Philipp was captured in Holland and died in 1944 in a concentration camp in northern Germany. When the war ended, it opened up a new horizon of opportunities for the commodity traders. The ruined cities of Europe and Asia needed rebuilding, and that would require steel, cement, and copper. The trade in natural resources, which had been tightly controlled by wartime governments, would be slowly freed in the new age of peace, and the dominance of the US on the world stage would herald a new era of growth and open markets. The pioneer of commodity trading had very different backgrounds and upbringings. Macmillan had been born into a wealthy family in the US Midwest. Jesselson was the son of a shopkeeper from the southern Germany, and Weisser had grown in the middle-class family in Hamburg, but that in Germany. But what they shared was an instinct for internationalism and willingness to travel the world in search of new opportunities. In the wake of the war, they set about building their companies into truly international enterprises, profiting from the globalization of the world economy and shaping it in the process. That meant adopting the outlook that many of their successors in the commodities trading industry still subscribe to: go everywhere, live in politics, and in many cases morality to one side. They traded with communists and capitalist countries alike, with rapacious local business people and government bureaucrats. The goal was to make a profit. As one of the Philip brothers' early traders put it, one of the basic rules of Philip Brothers is that business is supreme. Political matters are not business. So, of the three men, it was Ludwig Jesselson who most personified the globe-trotting approach of the early traders. With a piercing gaze was that magnified his ferocious intellect, Jesselson had arrived in the US in 1937 to escape the anti-Semitism sweeping Europe. He soon had a job trading scrap metal at Philip Brothers in New York, and while his fledgling career was put on hold by the Second World War, his ambition remained undimmed. In 1946, already a senior trader at Philip Brothers and determined to build the firm into a global business, he set out on the round the world trip. In the devastation left by the war, Jesselson, then 36 and fizzing with energy, saw his only opportunity. From New York, he traveled to Japan and India, Egypt, Germany, and Yugoslavia. It was years before commercial air travel across continents would become commonplace, and flights were irregular, long, and bumpy. But Jesselson was unfazed by a little discomfort, described by a colleague as a spark plug on Philip Brothers. He had supreme confidence in his convictions on the coming economic boom. He set out to hire dozens of new traders and open offices around the world. With this bald head, boundless energy, and intense glare from behind his thick-rimmed spectacles, Jesselson spied respect and devotion from his band of young traders. We all saw Jesselson as a father figure, somebody who gave young people a chance, says David Tendler, who rose up under his tutelage and went on the run Philip Brothers in the 70s and 80s. Under Jesselson, who took over running the company in 1957, Philip Brothers would be transformed from a mid-sized scrap and ore dealer with a staff of around 50 into the world's dominant metal trader, and the DNA of a company would be passed down from one generation of commodity traders to the next, creating a family of trading companies that still defines the global commodity industry. Just as Weisser had done in oil, Jesselson pioneered the metals trade with the communist world. One of the first prizes was Yugoslavia, where he had traveled on his world tour in 1946. Philip Brothers secured a contract with the state metal monopoly, Jugometal, to sell its entire metals output, linking the socialist government of Tito with capitalist America by 1950s. That was worth 15 to 20 million dollars of metals a year, more than one company's entire sales for just a few years earlier. By the late 50s, Philip Brothers was also buying ferroalloys from the Soviet Union and pig iron from East Germany. In 1973, it was able to boast in its annual report that it had for many years done a substantial business with the Soviet Union as well as with other Eastern European countries, As a result, it was one of the first 10 American companies allowed to establish offices in Moscow. The traders even supplied the US military stockpiles with metal from its Cold War adversaries. For Jesselson, the political implications were irrelevant. All that mattered was that it was profitable business, as said before. John H. Macmillan, Jr. was from a different world to Jesselson. He was more than a decade older, and he had grown up in a prosperous Midwestern family of Scottish origin, but the two men shared a passion for the business of trading and a tireless energy that exhausted all who tried to keep pace with them. Macmillan, known to everyone as John Jr., was born into the commodity trade. His father had run Cargill before him, and his education took place on the floor of Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce, where traders screamed orders at one another. It was a tough schooling, but an essential one. At Cargill, there was no greater insult than to be considered a businessman rather than a trader. Always smartly turned out, with a square jaw and a neat mustache, he looked the part of the head of a family enterprise. But behind his Midwestern poise was a driven businessman with a creative streak. He was an enormously restless person who was constantly inventing and creating. According to his son's account of him, for my father, the corporation came first, even before family. And in the early 1950s, he realized the corporation needed a new direction. So Cargill was an insular company focused on the US market, and it was missing out on a boom in the international trade. We are all terribly upset over missing out on the big volume export business, Macmillan told his senior staff. In part, for that oversight was a function of Cargill's good fortune to have been founded in one of the world's most rapidly growing bread baskets. The company had developed a solid business moving wheat, corn, and soybeans from the Midwest to the growing metropolises on the East and West Coast, while its European and South American rivals had been forced to look overseas for new business. Cargill hadn't needed to. Macmillan would change that. Like Jesselson at Philip Brothers and Weiser at Mabanaft, he set out to expand across the world. In 1953, he incorporated Tradex International, the unit that was to serve as his spearhead in the global market. In 1956, he opened the Geneva office of Tradex at Cargill's hub for international trading. The city was chosen for its excellent travel and communication facilities, its multilingual tradition, and its limited corporate taxes. The opening of the Tradex office would mark the beginning of a long and profitable partnership between Switzerland and the international commodity traders. Macmillan's strategy led Cargill, like Philip Brothers and Mabanaft, to forge new economic links with the communist world. But while the other pioneers were importing commodities from the communist bloc to the West, Cargill was building connections in the opposite direction, exporting American agricultural surpluses to the world, including the countries behind the Iron Curtain. The trade was encouraged by generous subsidies from the US government, seeking to support farmers whose ever larger harvests couldn't all be observed at home. Washington financed billions of dollars of exports, helping to spread the American diet around the world, and the grain traders helped deliver this wave of American grain. Cargill quadrupled the volume of its American grain exports between 55 and 65. Okay, we continue in the next video. Bye bye.